Welcome to Step Into the Pivot. We're your hosts. I'm Theresa Conti.
And I'm Ivana. We talk with people just like you. We have honest conversations about current issues that women and men face and how we pivot to address them in our lives.
This podcast is your companion as you step into a workout or take some time for yourself.
Welcome to Step Into the Pivot. I'm your host, Ivana.
Hi, everybody, and I am Theresa Conti, and I'm so excited to introduce our guest today, Nick Demas. So Nick is a Tony Award-winning Broadway producer. He's a documentary filmmaker. He's host of a podcast called The Creative Soulpreneur, and he's a story and speaking coach. He has 30 years of experience, has traveled from the Tony Awards to running a multi-million-dollar business in between. He works with entrepreneurs, experts, and uses storytelling to command the stages and dramatically increase their income and impact. So welcome today, Nick. We are so happy to have you here. And I'd love for you to just start and talk about what has brought you to coaching today.
Well, first, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. It's always a pleasure. Having a podcast, I know what it means to bring somebody to your audience. So thank you for having me first and foremost. Coaching today. How did this happen? How did I end up here? Truly, that began, and this is going to sound so strange, but it began at the Tony Awards. I was sitting in my seat, fourth row, the Tony Awards at Radio City Music Hall. And if you've never been to the Tony Awards, which very few people have, so I'm going to share this, it's a really long day. You're there about 6-7 hours sitting in that seat. You can't even get up to go to the bathroom without somebody coming to, take your seat. It's a whole thing, right? And I'm sitting there and I'm waiting and I'm waiting. And our category was the very last category of the night, Best Musical. And Bernadette Peters comes onto the stage, and she's got the envelope to give, with her little squeaky voice and her great hair, to give to give the announcement. And she opens the envelope and she takes a deep breath and she says, Memphis. And that was the name of the show that I produced. And everyone around me is standing up and they're screaming and they're happy and they're so excited. And I had this moment. The first thought I had was, oh my gosh, thank God my investors are going to get their money back. That was really my first thought. And then the second thought was, this is it. This is all this is. This isn't how this is supposed to feel. I wasn't feeling elated, excited. I was very numb. And they say it's like an out of body experience as you walk up onto the stage. And that's exactly what it was. I was just sort of in this fog walking up to receive this award that I had worked my entire career, my entire life for since I was 16 years old. And I'm standing up there on stage and I just had this moment of, wow, now what? What am I going to do with the rest of my life? Because this is what I thought that I wanted. And now that it's here, it does not feel good. And I went on a really deep adventure after that. Went and sat with a spiritual teacher, went and lived with him for a time, and really dove into why I had been so driven and without purpose, ultimately. And what could the next part of my life be? How could I be purposeful in where I was going, who I was going to be in the world, and how I could help people? Because I realized I'd put a lot of effort into getting a trophy. And yes, did a Broadway show help people? Sure, it makes people happy. It's not that it doesn't have value, but I felt a greater calling for something deeper.
So, Nick, let's go back in time and a little
Yeah.
deeper. You mentioned yourself at age 16. So take us back to the time when you were a dancer and Broadway performer at a very early age, and help us connect what then happened after the Tony Awards and that introspective journey with those early years.
I always knew what I wanted to do. Always. From the time I was 12 years old, I was in dance class, religiously in dance class. It's a discipline dance, right? And you are like a Olympic athlete, and you have a career that starts fast and burns out fast. Starts early, really, and burns out fast. And there was this mindset that I had of having to be perfect. And so every day I would go to that dance bar and I would practice over and over and over again to perfection. And so it instilled in me this idea that I had to be perfect, and that the only way to be perfect was to be awarded or rewarded for, and that's your sense of value. And so I think really I conflated that award, that recognition, that external validation with my sense of who I was ultimately. And once the Tony Awards happened, and I realized that it was more than me. I know that sounds very strange because you're winning a Tony Award for a show that is more than you. But when I realized it was more than me, that's when everything began to shift in my life. And I realized I was not ever really being of service to others. I was rather selfish. And that perfection was a form of selfishness, ultimately, which is a very strange thing to say, that, that trying to be perfect is selfish, but it was ultimately. And when I was able to begin to break that apart, and it took time, it wasn't an overnight thing. It wasn't like, oh, well, I'm no longer going to be perfect. I'm never going to try to be perfect. It was a process, a shedding, a letting go of some really habitual patterns beyond just the pattern of, pointing my toes at a bar, like patterns in my behavior, patterns in my relationships, patterns in the way that I had conversations with people, and really taking it from what's in it for me to how can I help you? What's in it for you?
I love that. And it's like you had to make that shift, right? That complete shift in your thinking. You talk about the selfishness, and and I think that can be true. Like that was almost like part of your identity, maybe, right? And so is that what you really recognized, and is that what's kind of started that shift?
Absolutely. It was realizing that my identity was so wrapped up in that Tony Award, in winning, in being the hot, latest, greatest thing, and being that professional who, because in that industry, only 2% of people actually work. So to be the top 2% just by working alone, and then to win a Tony Award, it's like 0.0000001% of the 2%. And that was my identity. It was so wrapped up in being superior, great, better than, in a way, rather than part of the whole.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious, Nick, you shifted from, speaking about that external validation, and then you highlighted the importance of service and being of service. But can you share a little more about the underneath all that, really recognizing or internalizing the values of your own being, of your own soul, your own presence? How is that, a part of this journey? Because
So
I find, yeah, when you talked about perfectionism, it's a form of control, and it runs on fear. What happens for you and all that?
So really, that was the process of self-actualization, of self-love, right? In order to be able to be of service to others, one must love the self. And so it really was this breaking, that's part of that breaking and shedding of the old image of who I thought I was, to come to who I actually am. And there were lots of practices. Obviously, there's lots of tools in the toolbox, as you well know. There's lots of tools in the toolbox that you offer folk, in that, yoga practice and meditation and therapy. And there was a series of it was beyond looking inward, because yes, looking inward is part of it, but it was action taking as well. And some of that action was not doing anything. Now that sounds strange, but it was about learning to be rather than learning to do, because I was such a doer. And I thought that value was based on what you do versus who you are. And so when I began to allow myself time to do nothing, I began to understand better who I actually was versus that external validation of who I thought I was.
I think that's a really valid point, honestly, because I see that in myself, just you talking about it, right? I see that in myself a lot. I'm always a doer. I'm always do, and what can I do for others? And sometimes that's hard to take the time for yourself. But I think that what you're saying is really true, right? It's really being able to, share that with yourself, right? Understand who you are. And one of the other things I know that you do, which I love to do as well, and I think Ivana loves to do as well, which is why we're doing a podcast, right? Is share our stories with others. And that's the way I kind of look at this, even this podcast, right? Even when we were talking about this, right? It's sharing our stories with others and letting others share their stories that might be able to help someone else. So can you talk a little about why you love sharing your stories and how that works for you to kind of bring you to where you're at today?
I think because I was a natural born storyteller, my mother would say that when I was 6 years old, I used to jump up onto a table and recite all the Grimm's fairy tales for anybody who would listen. So it was part of it, but I think we all are natural born storytellers. It's part of our DNA. It is embedded in us since the ancient times. We've been sitting around a fire and we've been sharing stories. At first, they believe it was from, whether or not they got food. The prey, whether the leader of the tribe went out to get food and came back and told the story of how they got the food or how they didn't get the food and why everyone was going to be hungry that night. And it is that far back into our psyche. And so when we share stories, we have this connection and this communal experience together that transcends the individual. And because of that natural ability that I had all those years ago meets that connection point, which is isn't that what we all crave now more than anything else, is connection. As connected, quote unquote, as we are in this world, the more disconnected we are feeling. And so if we can return back to those roots of sharing our stories to help us connect with others, that's where that juice is. That's where the goodness is. That's where we begin to realize how similar we actually are to each other in a world that tries to tear us apart.
We met at an event where you shared your story. Actually, you shared multiple stories about your life. And I experienced a big connection with you. At that point, I was just, I was in the audience, you were up on the stage. And the reason that connection was present immediately was because of your authenticity. Yes, your presentation was polished. Yes, it had a really nice arc. You had really cool teaching points that you did impart very successfully. Authenticity. So you really allowing us to see through you, inside you, and really get to know you in those few moments that you were up on the stage. That's what really pulled me in. And I know you now teach people also to share stories. Can you share a little bit about that?
I think what you tapped into there is that the more authentic that you are to who you actually are, the more drawn in people will be to what it is that you have to say. They're, word of the year, authentic, right? Webster's word of the year, because we are craving that. And it also, the other part of that is how are they like you? How are you like them? And when you can get that connection point with somebody, that magic, that alchemy happens. And then things like this happen, where you invite me to come on because I was so vulnerable is really the word. I was real and honest. And it wasn't just, oh, I won the Tony Award and look how great that I am, because I could go up there and say that. What I call the real story versus the true story. The real story is, yeah, I won a Tony. It's a real story. But the true story is that it was a turning point in my life that changed everything. And here's what I was actually feeling in the moment. That's the truth of the matter. And so I really, when working with students and clients, what I really do is dig in with them to get the true story so that they can share the parts that aren't necessarily as splashy and beautiful and pretty, but are the points that will be that connection for people. Because when you do that, that's when the world opens up for you. It's so ironic because we think that we're supposed to be perfect but when you actually are that authentic self, that's when people really respond to you. And that's when the world truly shifts and opens for you. Doors open, people, begin to say, I want to experience some of that.
And that's part of that authenticity work, right? Like you've said it in many different ways. And I absolutely agree with all of them. And that's really where that shines. And that makes you who you are. That makes people feel comfortable talking with you or listening to you or having an open mind or whatever that is, right? So talk a little, as we're kind of almost out of time, but we still have a couple minutes. I want you to talk a little about, because you've had a lot of pivots, and how that pivot really was a step forward, how that took you to where you're at today, right? And how those pivots all work together to get you here.
I think it's exactly what you said, that each one was a stepping stone. Each one was a door opening. And every time I opened the door, I stepped through. And what happened was I'd be in that room for a while, whatever that room was. But then I'd see a door in the corner and I'd step into the next room. But I wouldn't have been able to get to that room without having gone through the hallway of the other room, if that makes sense. And so each room led me to a new place or a space. And I can't say that I always chose the right door. Sometimes I would go into a room and go, whoa, this is not the door. That's not my room. I got to get back out of that room. But it would lead me to another room. And it was okay. I didn't have to stay in every room for a really long time. But each time I stepped into the next room, it led me to something that was so unique or interesting or more true to me, ultimately. That's actually the truth, is that every time I pivoted, every time I've moved into a new place or space, it's really been actually going deeper inward into who I truly am.
Yeah. And I think you probably recognize that, right? Like even though it might not have been the right door, there was something in there that drew you in and maybe you got from it before you moved to the next.
Nuggets of gold in those rooms. Nuggets of, sometimes more so than the right room. Sometimes I could get stuck in the right room for a bit of time because it was easy. But then when I would get out, and move into the next room, and then I'd be like, oh, the lessons were strong and powerful that I could take with me as I moved on.
So much courage in what you're sharing. I really picture you in this, in the room. You're describing it so beautifully. We can just see it right here in front of us, and then the bravery that it takes to
It's
move.
interesting that you say that, because I always thought of it as reverse.
Huh?
And that it wasn't it would have taken more bravery in a way, more courage to stay. For me, it was easier to go. And sometimes I had to learn that it was okay to be where I was.
Yeah. All of these choices, though, for me, courage is about flow. Courage is about, following where's the pull, or where's the nudge? And it can be, multi-directional, but opening to this intent to learn, intent to be loving in the face of no matter what.
Oh, that's so good. That's mic drop. Boom. That's really good. Yeah, see it very similarly. I think that the reason that I stepped through so many doors is because I was always open to what was next, what I could learn, and who I could become.
Yeah.
Thank you for giving us your time, your presence here. So grateful for the conversation. We could certainly keep talking and would love to have you back on the show.
Thank you.
For right now, we're signing off with so much to digest and continue to be inspired by.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me, truly.
Yeah. Thank you again to our guest, Nick Demos. And we are going to sign off for this episode of Step Into the Pivot. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Step Into the Pivot. We hope you found inspiration and valuable insights from our conversation. Remember, life is a series of pivots, and it's in those moments of change that we truly grow.
If you enjoyed today's episode and want to stay connected, make sure to check out our websites. You'll find additional resources, behind-the-scenes content, and more details about our incredible guests. We love hearing from listeners, so reach out with your thoughts, questions, or your own pivot stories.
To keep the conversation going, be sure to follow us on social media. We're on LinkedIn and Instagram, where we share updates, quotes, and engage with our amazing community.
If you haven't already, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Your feedback makes a difference, and it helps us bring you meaningful conversations. We're signing off, reminding you that every pivot is a step forward. Take care, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Step Into the Pivot.